D&D, that's an abbreviation for Dungeons and Dragons. That is a tabletop role-playing game. Now, role-playing aside, it's a tabletop game. You play that on a table with a bunch of people around it. You know, games like Monopoly, Risk, Clue, those are all like tabletop games, and you're all kind of playing, you're competing against each other. But unlike Monopoly or Risk or Clue, it's not so much competitive as it is cooperative. You're trying to bring all the players in, try to meet a certain goal. It's far different from most of your tabletop games that would share an objective like that otherwise, though, because when you're doing that in a tabletop game, it's like, oh, it's you, the person, that you're doing this, versus a role-playing game, which is you play a role, like you represent, a character is representing you, rather. So it's more of a it's less of a, oh, Aaron is going to go into the door, versus Aaron is controlling a character named Richard, and Richard's going through the door. So that's what they mean by role-playing. So what struck it as interesting to me was, well, I first got invited to play the game with a few people. I was like, okay, this will be a new game. This is interesting. I'm not really sure how to play it though, much like any new game. But when they brought me into it, it was like, well, most games have like hard rules of very narrow, here's what you can do. You can move around the board after you roll 2 6-sided dice, for example, like Monopoly. It's like, well, in this one it's pretty open. It's not even set on a board most of the time. It's just, hey, wherever your mind takes you, the theater of the mind. Hey, wait, no, I can do more than just what you're telling me I can do right now. They're like, well, yeah, you can do more than that. Like, okay, what are my options? They're like, well, what can you think of? I was like, oh, that's really interesting. So it's more of an open solution type game. It's not like, oh, you have to collect everything and then you can go in. It's more of a, what are some interesting ways we can go about approaching a problem that you could only find in a role-playing game versus just a standard tabletop or even video game in some cases. So, with money, well, there's money outside of and inside of the game, I guess you could say. Well, outside of it, you can spend that on dice, you can spend that on books that tell you what the rules are for the game. And then there's more books you can buy on that in case you want to like a different experience with the game and whatnot. Treat it like an expansion. Some games, notably Catan, have a lot of expansions. So Dungeons and Dragons does that as well. Wealth inside of the game, however, anybody who's played like Monopoly or any video game like that can tell you how important money is. That's how you buy things. That's how you progress. In Dungeons and Dragons, money is actually entirely optional if you don't want anything. I know some people who have their characters just completely forgo money altogether, either for religious or philosophical reasons, of course, to the character, maybe even to the player themselves. But more often than not, it's just them trying to go about some things at a different angle. So one of the more common dice that you'll see across pretty much every game on the table, like Monopoly or like with Risk, you'll see 6-sided die. Of course, in Dungeons and Dragons, we'll refer to this as a D6, which means it is a dice that has 6 sides. So D6. You'll notice on this set, it'll have just the actual number itself and not the dots or the bumps in them, like with other sets. However, the D6 is not actually the most common die in Dungeons & Dragons. The most common one you will see is the D20. That's used for pretty much everything. Also very common in the game are the D8, the D4, and then the ever so used D12. That one doesn't get used as much as all the others, so it kind of feels left out. It's actually one of the running jokes of the community is, look at how infrequent the use of the D12 is. And so one of the more interesting dice here is actually the 10-sided dice, the D10. Probably the most notable thing about it is it doesn't stay completely flat when you put it down like that. It just wants to fall over. And also noticeable about it is it doesn't actually have a 10, it just has a 0 there, which is meant to be 10, but it's 0. And then paired with it is what we call a percentile die. Essentially what you do with this is you take the numbers on the front there, you have like 80, you have 40, you have 60, and then you would pair it with this one when you roll it. So if it landed on 40 and 1, you'd have 41. So the recommended number of people you would play a game with is about 5. Because you would have one person be the dungeon master, which is abbreviated as the DM in most cases. That person sort of runs the game. And then you would want roughly 4 players. Now that would make it enough people so that the game's interesting, but also a small enough group that it's not super chaotic and everyone's kind of doing their own thing. Because I currently run about 12 people in one campaign for the school, and let me tell you, that thing gets wild quick. So a very small number, like 4 is usually manageable. 3 is also manageable, but if you have about 2 people, it's kind of menial. It's like, oh, you just have a duo there. There's not much to be done here because they can only do so much, especially within the confines of the game. So I first started playing Dungeons and Dragons all the way back in 2014. That was 1 year after high school. Now, even though they had like updated versions of the rules, like 5th edition, for example, is what most people do now. My friend group then wanted to play with an older set of rules, and it's like, okay, well, I wasn't aware that there were other sets of rules. So when I was introduced to that, it really threw my mind for a spin, but I mean, in either regard, it is the same game. It's just different hard rules. Like, you can do this, but it has to be done this way, for example, is a few things that can change over a course of rule sets. But it is essentially the same game in either case. It's just the dungeon master tells you what's going on, where your characters are, then you tell him or her, you say what you want to do, and then they tell you what happens as a consequence of that. And then you say what you want to do again, and it's just rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. And sometimes you get good outcomes, sometimes you get bad outcomes. And then sometimes it could go either way, really, which is why they make you roll the polyhedrons.